allow me to bring up my presentation.
Yeah, we can see your screen now, sir.
All right. So yeah, once again, welcome everybody. As our program manager has said, tonight we'll be talking about policy design, planning, and implementation. And this is just to sensitize us on what policies are, how to develop them, and what to do to ensure that they succeed. And I think the background to this is that, especially in Africa, we have a lot of policy designs, fantastic policies all over the place. But at the end of the day, they don't achieve their objectives. And in this discussion, we're focusing mainly on governance, that is policy design, planning and implementation as it pertains to government and government functions. So let's go. After this training, what we'd like to see is that people are able to articulate frameworks and understand their influence on policy conception, diagnosis and implementation. Be able to analyze the causes and sub-causes of policy problems within micro and macro governance. We're going to be talking about a tool like the Chicago diagram, which I'll see later. One should be able to strategically align policy solutions to national problems across various stakeholders. Design and recommend policy based on robust diagnosis, analysis, and prognosis. To be able to use tools like I mentioned as a Chicago diagram and to inspire and mobilize relevant stakeholders in policy recommendation for effective implementation. So this is the course content, and this is how we're going to go about it. So I'll dive into it right away. What is policy? Many people talk about policy, be it personal policy, organizational policy, government policies, and so on and so forth. It's all based on the same thing. Policies are the guidelines or a set of principles that guide governing authorities in their course of action. So you want to take action, or you want to plan an outcome. There needs to be some policies in place which will guide the behaviors of people, both those in government and those who are and the public. Policies are guides to thinking and decision making. They reflect and interpret objectives and guide decisions to achieve the objectives. They establish a framework for planning programs. And in developing policies, there are three key elements. Number one is the problem definition. So every policy is actually aimed at solving a problem or addressing some issues. So there must be a definition of what you want to address. Second to that is, what goals do you want to achieve? By setting these policies in place, what do you want to achieve by putting these policies, by developing these policies? And then what are the policy instruments to address the problem and achieve the goals? So you can even begin to see from here that if policies are not properly developed following these elements, the problem already starts from the foundation. If there's no clear definition, the goals are not clear, and the policy instruments are not in place, then the failure starts from the beginning. Now, looking at public policy, it's a system of laws or regulatory measures, causes of action, and funding priorities promulgated by a government entity to address specific topics that affect citizens or organizations. Policies are conscious choices, and they are not accidents. The result from government decisions are not those of other actors in society, such as private companies or other non-governmental organizations. A public policy is a system of laws or regulatory measures that government puts in place to address certain things and to achieve set objectives. So, for example, we have the National Housing Policy, which states how to ensure that Nigerians own or have access to decent, safe, and healthy housing accommodation at affordable cost. I think a part of that housing policy is also what we have as the National Housing Fund. All those things derived from the National Housing Policy. How do we get people to get decent housing? And if you can see already, that's a monumental failure. You have the National Policy on Environment that points to how to ensure environmental protection and the conservation of natural resources for sustainable development. You have the National Policy on Education, which provides the philosophical foundation of the educational system aimed at streamlining efforts in the education sector. You can see that there are issues in that sector already, serious ones. This policy on education constitutes a blueprint for education development and is a reference point for educational plan implementation. Like you have the Nigerian National Policy on Education, the NPA. So these are sectors that already have major issues. All right. Now let's look at designing policy. Designing policies involves identifying goals and selecting policy instruments with which the goals can be reached. I said that initially at the beginning, that there are three key elements: the problem, definition, the target goals, and the policy instruments. So policy goals are the basic aims and expectations governments have in deciding. They are the policy basic aims and expectations governments have in deciding to pursue or not to pursue some kind of action. Policy means are the techniques they use to attain those goals. So talking about national housing policy, for example, the basic aim, the objective is to ensure that Nigerians have decent housing in safe and healthy environment. And you can already know that's not being achieved. Policy means are the techniques used to attain those goals. So part of that is the putting together the National Housing Fund for people to contribute, getting government to allocate resources, planning and all sorts. So policy design, the process. First thing is to set an agenda, and that derives from the problem definition. So this process is a process, the agenda setting is a process through which a policy and the problem it is intended to address are acknowledged to be of public interest. So there can be a myriad of long list of issues or problems that can be on the table. The government, functionary or agency will then look at them and prioritize and be able to decide which one is really of greatest public interest. And that forms the basis of defining the problem and setting an agenda to formulate a policy. So for a policy to be placed on the agenda, the problem situation must be identified, solutions proposed, and government must have been engaged and positioned to intervene. Like I said, we are focusing on government policies here. The policy formulation, we're looking at the processes now. So first is the agenda setting, and next is to formulate the policy. At this stage, various policy options are examined as possible solutions. This is like putting on the table several concepts or proposals. And all of them will be examined as possible solutions. While that is being done, they will be assessed, and then the most probable or practicable one, or the one that is likely to solve the problem will be adopted. And then that is the adoption stage. That is the stage at which the government makes a decision in favor of one or more approaches to addressing the given problem. And the implementation is when the policy implementation parameters are established, and this can directly affect the eventual outcome of the policy. if you begin to look at this, and I mean, you're just thinking about them, you can begin to see that if you look at the way our government run in Nigeria and Africa, you can begin to see where some of the big issues come from. What are the considerations when we are trying to design a policy? So we're going to look at this difference between policy design and other forms of design. So I'm involved in the oil and gas industry, and particularly design. So we design structures and facilities. And those things generally perform the function for which they are designed. If you use the correct parameters, the correct standards, you get what you want from them. But then, when it comes to formulating policies, designing policies, it addresses human behavior, sorry, as a primary target. So you can immediately see that policy design and implementation will not be as easy as designing a structure or facility, like a mechanical structure, electrical structure, that you can automate and to do what you have programmed it to do. Human beings are the most difficult entities to manage. So the fundamental difference is the need of policy design to cope with human beings rather than inventions. Individuals and organizations are not so compliant and will not necessarily behave as expected. I've said that. So policy design must take human factors into account and find needs. Oh, sorry, I need to go back. And find needs of creating sufficient incentives or disincentive to achieve an adequate level of compliance. And this is why really I have a lot of interest in this, because it's just about getting people to do things the way you want them to do it. It's about interacting with people, it's about managing people, which is something I really have a passion for. So policy design, you must know also. Okay, I see hands raised up.
Yes, it appears your slides, they are hidden, I guess. We've been on the first slide, that's what we could see.
Oh boy. How do I, what can I do then? Who can help me? I'm on slideshow. So maybe I should go back and just, okay, just hold on, let me see. See. Just a minute. Can you see my slide now?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, let me see if you can you see has it changed?
Yes, it has changed now.
I think I will just stick to running this. Just hold on.
All right.
Just hold on. Let me know if it has changed. Hello.
We can't see your slides at the moment. I think you stopped sharing.
I'll just do it manually if you're using a slideshow.
All right.
Can you see this course content?
Yes, sir.
All right. Have you seen this? Public policy.
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, so I've talked about that.
All right. Thank you,
Okay.
sir.
And then examples of public policy, national housing policy, national policy on environment, national policy on education. And then policy design, we talked about policy goals and policy needs. And then the policy design process. Agenda setting, policy formulation, policy adoption, and implementation. Confirm that you see my slides as they change.
It was still on the examples slide. Yes, policy design considerations now, sir.
Okay. So just help me as we go along. Once I change, I start talking about something else. If you're not seeing what I'm talking about, kindly indicate.
All right.
So I already talked about this, how policy design differs from other forms of design. I will say the key difference is that in policy design, we're dealing with human behavior, and it's difficult to get people to behave in a certain way, while it's easier to get inanimate structures or mechanical or engineering design to do what you want. Because once you follow the standards, they do what they're supposed to do, but human beings are not that way. So policy design in itself is political, majorly political, especially in the public sector. And this can impose certain constraints on action because people put forward party considerations, sometimes geographical considerations, and so on and so forth. Even in Nigerian context, ethnic or tribal considerations come in, and then even sometimes religious. So policy design is political, and this actually puts a lot of constraints on action. The politics involved may be partisan, involving multiple political parties, or they may primarily organizational politics, driven by agencies within the bureaucracy. You can have different agencies within the same organization competing or playing, pursuing their own individual agenda. Policy design will involve the engagement of social actors and citizens. That is extremely important. And this is one of the strong pillars of policy implementation and success. Engagement of social actors and citizens. And this is where many of our policy makers and implementers fail. While design in many industrial or artistic settings may be individual, design in a political setting is usually a collective activity. So because it is political, it's not what one person just gets up, puts something on the table and runs with it. It's a collective thing. You must get people's buy-in. You must identify what your stakeholders. I'll come to that. So it's a collective activity, and it involves the interaction of multiple actors. Confirm that you see my the correct slides.
Yes, sir.
All right. So policy design is political, and it involves values. Since it involves humans, we must necessarily take fundamental human values into consideration. And human behavior is the ultimate target of most policy design. It aims to influence or coerce the individual directly. These are positions that scholars have put forward, like the ones quoted in Minton and Jide 2017. In modern times, governments seek to move away from command and control instruments towards softer instruments that shape the environment of behavior rather than the behavior itself. So you begin to work on the environment of behavior rather than pushing people or forcing people. When you do certain things in the environment, it moves people to also behave in a certain way. So, for example, I mean, I tell people in many of our major cities in Nigeria, we see major intersections. You have markets and people selling things around the road. You want to stop that. So, I mean, sometimes people, they bring in, the government will bring in the security agencies to drive them away, or so-called task force. And after some time, these guys come back. But you just go there, clean up the place, beautify the place, put some modern structures or artifacts there, and boom, everybody keeps away. And I mean, a good example of that, we see that in Lagos, we see that in Port Harcourt, some parts of Port Harcourt, where hoodlums or miscreants will gather under the bridge before, and we turn into parks and nice things, gardens in Lagos and Port Harcourt, and see that the places are, all those guys are coming. So you can work on the environment of behavior, target that rather than the behavior itself. Citizens generally prefer less intrusive policy instruments. People don't like to be pushed or coerced. And also, citizens want to maintain their personal autonomy and often will resist policy designs that impose too many constraints on individual freedom of action. I mean, you could remember it's not too long ago, the restrictions placed on citizens because of the COVID-19. After a while, people started complaining. Even if it was for our own good, stay home, use your mask, wash your hands, maintain physical distance. After a while, even in developed countries, people started complaining. This thing is too much. Why are you harassing us? Why are you restricting us? So that's the way human beings behave. Part of the considerations in designing policy also is that usually it is done when I'm talking about governance, it's in a democratic context. And so democracy is a central value to be considered in all policy designs. This is a position put forward by Schneider and England. Democracy should be seen as both a cause and a consequence of policy design. The level of democracy and the type of democracy will influence the policy designs that emerge from the policy process, given variations in the involvement of social actors. So because in a democracy, you want to at least be seen to be considering the populace, so to say, and possibly your immediate democratic party or democratic context. So it's both a cause and a consequence. The level of democracy and type of democracy will influence policy design that emerge from policy process, given the relations in the involvement of social actors. Democratic systems that are open to expand influences and that consult widely will produce design that reflect a broad range of social concerns. So, I mean, if you practice an more open type of system of democracy, there will be wider consultations, and this will produce designs that reflect a broad range of social, broad range of designs, and that will reflect a broad range of social concerns. So, democracy is a good consideration in drawing up these policies. It's not something you just draw up and force down people's throats. It must be done within a democratic context, which means that people's feelings, people's aspirations must be taken into consideration. So, still looking at policy design considerations. Let's talk about the fact that it's in a democratic context. Talk about the fact that it's political and targets human behavior. So targeting policies need to hit their desired target to achieve success. At the beginning, we mentioned that every policy must have a key objective and identify the problem. The target is to solve or address an issue or problem. to the policy. So for a policy to succeed, it must hit the target it was designed. So social policy should attempt to provide benefit for all who are eligible. For example, the macroeconomic policy should aim at economic growth without causing inflation. So if you are putting in place a policy that is to enhance economic growth, that should happen without causing other problems like inflation. And I mean, Nigeria is a very wonderful example. In the past 10, 15 years, we've seen several economic policies that are supposedly aimed at improving the economy, and then what the result is hardship, inflation, and more poverty. So for policy to succeed, they must hit the desired target. Targeting should be considered seriously. It plays a key role in the success of failure. Targeting could be challenging because policies often depend upon individuals behaving as they are expected to. We mentioned that before, that one of the key challenges with policy design is that it's trying to get people to behave in a certain way. People, of course, it's not always aligned. The government can provide incentives or threaten the use of sanctions, but if citizens do not want to comply, they will not. I just mentioned the example of the COVID-19 restrictions. People began to complain, and the government had to kind of use soft threats of sanctions to get people to do what they're supposed to do. Wearing a mask in public places. In Lagos State, for example, there was a restriction to maybe maximum of 50 people in certain public places, and when people went against that, they were prosecuted and fined. That's a way of getting people to do what you want to do, to behave the way you want them to. Targeting can be difficult because governments are intervening in complex processes. For example, the economy that I mentioned. There are many levers that are contained in the economy. So it's difficult to predict how they will that. Targeting is also difficult because of the behavior of policymakers themselves. So sometimes you wonder, you need to examine the motive of the policymakers themselves, especially in our African democratic context. What are the underlying motives of policymakers when they're developing these policies? Another consideration in designing a policy is modulation. There should be proper modulation of biases and responses. I've mentioned that as I was talking. So there will be biases, there will be responses, positive and negative. They can swing to any extreme. So there has to be some kind of modulation. There may be underreaction or overreaction of policymakers when confronting policies, especially on familiar ones. When governments create policies, positive feedback, for example, may reinforce overreaction. If people are, they get positive feedback from advocates or from beneficiaries, that will make government overreact and believe that the policy is doing well or something like that, and not be completely in sync with the realities. Policy overreaction will usually lead to the inefficient use of resources, money, and authority. So people can jump forward without taking time to look at the real reality on ground. And then there can also be underreaction, which is a more common challenge. Governments may not have reacted to a number of today's policy problems. They may not be on their active agenda because of lack of resources, or maybe to avoid failure by not taking on a difficult problem, or constrained by certain institutional structure of government, maybe legislature, and so on and so forth. And this is more of what we see in the African context, underreaction of policymakers. And that's why they fail. And that's why we are where we are. And the objective, one of the key objectives of these sessions we have at South Africa is to bring to focus, to bring to focus things that should be done, how to make things succeed, and reposition ourselves in the African context. So an effective approach to policy design requires at least 4 key elements, which I'll talk about 3 main ones, but this is breaking it down, adding one more thing. So an effective approach to policy design requires at least 4 key. An understanding of the problem, we talked about that one. I'll be showing this Ishikawa diagram, which is a cause and effect diagram. An understanding of available instruments to address the problem, an understanding of the values by which the outcomes of the policy should be evaluated. The designer must understand the manner in which these 4 elements interact and can be used for attempting to correct ongoing social and economic processes. Policy design in practice requires very significant levels of substantive policy knowledge and political understanding. So it's not something you just jump into. You must understand the political context, the issues, the challenges. You must understand how to develop policies. You must have a proper vision of what policy, of what that policy should how would I put it now? Should deliver in terms of solution to an existing problem. And so, having put together the agenda, having understood what needs to be done, there needs to be done policy planning. Sorry, before I go into that, I just skipped something. So, talking about understanding issues on ground or problems that we're using a policy to solve. This is a very wonderful tool. This looks like a fishbowl. It's called the Ishikawa diagram. So on the left, you have the causes. It could be equipment cause, depending on what you're looking at. It could be process, equipment if you're looking at, for example, the industry. It could be some processes. It could be people, like we're talking about investment. It could be management, managerial in organizations. It could be environment, it could be materials. So you have primary causes of problems, you have secondary causes. A policy designer must understand this very well. What are the causes of the problems on ground? And then understand the effect of those causes, which is the problem we're trying to solve. So we can identify a problem that the policy will solve. But to be able to fully address that, we need to understand the causes of that problem. That's what we have to do. So the right hand side under effect is a problem state identified. But then what is causing that problem to understand? We have to have a good policy. Gary, please confirm you're seeing my slides.
We can, sir.
All right then. So then we look at policy planning. There's a common saying that if you fail to plan, then you are planning to fail. So planning is extremely important. And this is the development of sound plans with indicators and targets for us to be able to implement the activity successfully. And it's the development of sound plans with indicators and targets. Planning is setting out the means through which goals to be achieved are set out, and the steps to be taken to reach those goals. So planning requires step-by-step the other actions or processes that must be completed in order to achieve the goals. So it's one thing to talk about policies, it's something to make statements, problem definition, set agenda, plan policies, but then there must be planning to get things done within time frames with proper indicators that you can use to measure success. Effective planning involves both short-term and long-term planning. So, I mean, like I mentioned before, we talk about Nigeria has we have the mid-term and the long-term development plan, which we have never seen the results. We keep pushing the target dates. At one time it was year 2000, then it became year 2010, our development plan, and then it became 2020. Now maybe we're looking at 2040 or 2050. So we have long-term plans, which are used to set out the goal and the step and resources required to accomplish that goal. Short-term plans used to describe in greater detail how the long-term plan can be put in place over a specific period of time. So you can have a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan for the long-term plan. But then the short-term plan is used to break into contour things that need to be done in the short term to achieve the long term. So planning sets out what is to be done and how performance will be evaluated. This is very important because in many organizations, even in personal life and government, people start to do things without having any parameter to measure performance, no evaluation. So it's difficult to tell if one is making progress or not. And then planning also helps to in deciding how to allocate task resources. So what are the planning steps? Number one is develop a vision. We'll talk about that. You know what the problem is, you know what you want to achieve to solve the problem. So you set the priorities. You set what is called the VOI, the vision, the objective, and the indicators. Indicators are what you use to measure success. And then you write it down, develop an action plan. This is not only for government, as we talk about it now, but this will also help our personal life, to help our personal effectiveness in whatever we do. So then communicate it in the context of governance. The plan must be communicated to those that will implement it, to publicize it. Coordinate the strategic plans from different arms, economic, legal, social, communication, and media strategies to be put in place to help achieve this plan. And then review and revise. Priorities can change because of different levers working in different ways. Priorities, resources, and situations change over time. So you need to review and revise the plan. It's not something you just plan and work with. This is just a pictorial representation of policy planning or the strategic planning cycle. So you set up your goals based on the problem you want to solve, and then you also set up desired outcomes. Where do you want to go? Your strategies, how do we get there? Strategies put in place, like I said, communication, legal, social strategies, and so on and so forth. And then measures and targets. How did you do? That's checking the results. And then from the results, you analyze the results and then review and then come up with ways to improve. So for example, we're talking about election 2023. We have INEC that have the responsibility to conduct the elections. They are undergoing what we call a voters registration right now. So what is the goal? Is to get as many eligible voters to register and have their voters cards. That's the goal. The desired outcome is that maybe at least 95% or 100% actually register. That is where we want to be. So how do we get there? That's a strategy. We have several registration centers in major cities and local and locality, urban and rural areas. It's strategies in place to get to people, making it easier for people to register. And then measures and targets is from time to time you check, okay, so how many people are registered? In this local government, we have, for example, 5 million people that are eligible. We want to get at least 4 million to register. So there has to be a way to check that. After maybe every 2 weeks, how many people are registered? That's the result. So what else can we do to achieve our goal? And that's so it's one and so forth. So in policy planning is the same way. There must be a constant review of outcome against the targets. And then we go back and we tune the strategies and keep refining until we get what we want. We talked about policy instruments, 3 major arms of policy design. We talked about understanding the problem, we talked about having the policy instruments in place. So policy instruments are things that lead policy formulation and the implementation. They are the tools that we use to achieve the implementation of the policy. These are means of government intervention in market or society to accomplish goals. Policy instruments are also known as governing tools. And sustainability of things depends on what instruments are selected. If you want your policy to be sustainable and well implemented, it will depend on what instruments are selected and how they have been applied. Assessment of policy instruments thereby can be an important component of policy sustainability. So just similar to what I just said about the planning cycle, from time to time, these policy instruments need to be checked, assessed to see their effectiveness, and then, if need be, review or change in order to make sure that the policy is sustainable. The behavioral assumption underlying the policy instrument is that it attempts to get people to do things that they might not otherwise have done. Recall at the beginning of this discussion, we said one key aspect of policy design is that it is directed at people's behavior, and it is not always easy to get people to do what you want. So one of the assumptions underlying the policy instrument is that your instrument, the policy instrument, the need is it attempts to get people to do things they may not want to do. So for example, economic policy instrument. This is an individual economic tool can be used to manipulate an economic variable to achieve an economic objective. So for example, we have interest rates, tax rates, subsidies, minimum price and wages, and legislation. So governments may want to encourage investment in a certain sector of the economy, and so they introduce subsidies or tax holidays. But if you invest in this industry, in this area of the economy, you will be allowed not to pay tax, for example, maybe for 5 years or 10 years, just to encourage people to come into that area of the economy. And sometimes wages also can be used to entice people, or outright legislation. Outside the legislation, acts and laws to make people do what they want to do. And of course, also interest rates to encourage investment. Sometimes government will slash interest rates. These are all examples of policy instruments. So now let's look at policy implementation. I'm tempted to say this is about the most important, but of the truth, all of them are equally important. You can't really leave one out and do the other. They're all legs that help to stabilize the policy. So policy implementation, these are actions taken to put policies into practice. Just as simple as that. Actions taken to put policies into practice. And this consists of an implementation structure. So we talk about planning, but then there must be an implementation structure. How do we get things in? How do we get them done properly and timely within allocated resources? It consists of decision making within agencies, target group behavior and policy results, operation of the design policy proposal, implemented by the respective government department and agencies. These are all aspects of policy implementation. Key factor that may determine the effectiveness of the policy and how well it can achieve its objectives. The type and complexity of the problem we talked about that. Magnitude of the expected change and determine the effectiveness of the policy, how well it can achieve its objectives. We're expecting huge changes in that retaliation. Again, targeted groups. Human and financial resources related to implementation. The administrative structure and regulation to support implementation is a key factor that will affect effectiveness. So when you talk about targeted group, for example, recently I read that government has now opened some of our land borders. There were shops. They've been shut for about 3 years now. That was targeted at a certain group of business people that were bringing in goods from neighboring country, either by smuggling or bringing it to the cheaper rate, competing with some local products. So those are targeted people, and government expected to achieve some gains. Whether those gains are achieved or not, it remains to be seen about the way. So effective implementation is affected by the following: public and stakeholder engagement. This cannot be overemphasized, as I mentioned before at the beginning. There must be proper engagement of all stakeholders. And so there are a key aspect of this also is the identification of the stakeholders. One of the key challenges we have in the African context is that the elites only consider themselves, the political parties, those in government, and proper cognizance is not taken of the public, the people that are directly affected or who are suffering from a particular problem. So there's a need to properly engage those who are most likely to be affected by the policy. Engage them, find out what's their opinion, what are their perspectives, what's their understanding of it. And a good example of this is the way many of the multinational oil companies used to operate. Maybe some of them selected that even indigenous. You go into a community to do oil exploration or exploitation, and then you decide that, oh, let's build a school for this community, or let's build a hospital, without engaging them to find out what exactly are the critical needs of that community. And you see, over the years, that has not worked very well. And many of them are now changing to what we call signing memorandum of understanding, MOUs, with the community, whereby members of the community sit down with the company representative and even government representative and all discuss and agree what are the key needs of this community. They sign the agreement and then together they implement it. And that's how it's supposed to be. So public and stakeholder engagement is extremely important. You need to know what your stakeholders. Government strategic directions also affect policy. The government says we want to move from point A to B. How do we get it from point A to B? That also affects how policies are developed. The proposed policy must align with strategic directions of the government. Impact on targeted populations. I talked about that when I talk about stakeholder engagement. Will the implementation in a rural or remote area have to differ from implementation in an urban area? Very important. Very, very important. There are certain things, for example, the policy will require people to do. Like this, how would I put it now? Maybe NIN is NIN registration. It may not be as easy for people in the rural area as it is for people in the urban area to link your SIM card with NIN number, something like that. For people in rural areas, and River State, for example, in those water, rural areas, may not be as easy. So how do we get this to them in an easy way? So those are key things that impact implementation. Optimal utilization of resources. We must ensure optimal utilization of resources when implementing policies. Of course, this is another area of problem for us in Africa, where resources are contracted and misappropriated. And then lastly, continuous improvement. Like I showed before in the life cycle, we must keep checking the results and seeing the results are anything close to what was intended. If not, ways must be found to improve. Another important, and maybe the last, is policy monitoring. So you set the agenda, you have developed, you're implementing with your policy instruments, you are checking your result, but then there must be monitoring, constant monitoring. That's what actually would help in continuous improvement that I mentioned last. So monitoring is a process by which stakeholders follow and assess policies to ensure they are developed, endorsed, enacted, and implemented as intended. If you look at several House of Assemblies in Nigeria, there are things that have been brought to the table 4 years, 8 years, nobody is checking whether they're making any progress, and they're just lying down for the They never become, they never pass, those bills are never passed into law because people doesn't do the work that is required to show that those things see the light of day. So there must be a systematic collection of data to inform policymakers and other stakeholders whether a new policy is being implemented in accordance with expectations. Many times we sign things into law and we just go back to sleep. And I mean, in our society, we can see that several fantastic policies, laws, acts, plans, they are just lying down there, nobody is implementing them. Indicators are used for monitoring purposes to judge, for example, if objectives are being achieved or if allocated funds are being spent appropriately. What are the indicators in place? Policy monitoring involves appraisal of the policy environment, gauging the level and quality of stakeholder engagement, these are things I've mentioned, documenting the progress of policy development and the legislative endorsement, putting policies into practice through financing and implementation planning, evaluating outcomes of implementation. For all we have discussed so far, you can see that being a policymaker, sitting somewhere in government, is not a walk in the park. It's not a stroll in the park. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of pre-work, a lot of work in getting the thing developed, a lot of work implementing, and a lot of work monitoring to be sure that you achieve the set objective. A lot of work engaging the people who are impacted, the public. And then also, we have policy evaluation. Again, it involves data collection and analysis to make judgments about the context. Do we have the right, are we implementing the right context? What are the activities that are needed to successfully implement? Are they being carried out properly? What are the outcomes of the policy process? Evaluation will inform and improve policy development, adoption, implementation, and effectiveness, and focus on the achievement of results. So show me your results. I'll tell you whether your policy is successful or not. Now, all the discussion we had is aimed or was aimed at making sure that people develop policies that do not fail. Unfortunately, most of the policies we have in Nigeria, in Africa, they fail. So several factors combine to determine policy outcomes and how well it achieves the objective. The type and complexity of the problem, the magnitude of observed outcome, the human and financial resources devoted, administrative structures that we put in place to support implementation of the policy. The policy must be credible. Technically well designed policy will fail if not believable to the public. If a policy is designed and people are not really people are not inclined to believe that it will work. I mean, people just, it may not work because you are depending on their behavior. Economic policies in particular need to demonstrate credible commitment towards sustainability. Businesses need to believe that a policy will remain in place before they invest money, which is so important. Many government policies do not achieve the set objectives and are considered to have failed. Why do policies fail in Africa? Faulty policy design caused by poor understanding of the problem, insufficient knowledge of the implementation context, unclear and even contradictory goals, lack of political will and absence of political backing, poor implementation plan and framework, incompetence, corruption, lack of resources, bad governance, lack of continuity. For example, poor performance of education policy implementation in Nigeria. I mean, education in Nigeria is in deep crisis, and it calls for a state of emergency, right from primary to university level. The policies are not just working. Economy is another area. Housing, as we mentioned. I mean, just name it. Transportation, healthcare. That's healthcare in Nigeria is just in shambles. But then there are policies in place, but they're not being properly implemented. So I'd like to pause or stop here and encourage some discussions or participation, questions or contributions.